Adolescence can be a very difficult time. Your body is doing strange, unexpected things. Bodily fluids are emerging from places they don't usually emerge. Hormones can make you unreasonable, emotional, even aggressive. And you start becoming curious about this weird thing that all adults seem to partake in called sex. Teenage years and adolescence play a huge role in all aspects of the horror genre for obvious reasons. They're often pretty horrific. But they're particularly important in the slasher genre. For most people, the slasher genre is synonymous with misbehaving teenagers, drinking, doing drugs, and having sex. But while Psycho and Peeping Tom did introduce the idea of the psychopathic, knife-wielding murderer, and Giallo added gore and extravagant death scenes into the mix, neither had really focused on young people. Tonight, we're going to discuss two movies that put adolescence and teenage problems front and centre, that would influence all slashers for decades to come. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the slasher and look at two particularly underrated gems, Alfred Sole's Alice Sweet Alice and Bob Clark's phenomenal Black Christmas.
Gonna fetch a rabbit skin to wrap his baby egg missing.
Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. I've got a really exciting show for you this week. Two movies I am particularly excited about discussing. First of all, please do get in touch with us. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, or you can tweet us at evolutionpod. I want to say a huge thank you before we get started to everyone who has supported the podcast so far. Thank you so much. The podcast has been doing much better than I ever expected it to this early on, and that's down to all of the lovely support and comments and reviews that we've been getting on things like iTunes. So I just wanted to quickly acknowledge that, and I'm going to really quickly run through names of everyone that has left me a review on iTunes this week, and I'm going to try and keep this up every week. So please do drop us an iTunes review or rating, and I will give you a shout out at some point down the line. So here's everyone that has given me a review so far. I apologise in advance. Some of these screen names, these usernames, are a bit weird, but I'm going to try my best to read them all. So a big thank you to Fats Coleman, 13FFX, to JCN Harris, to Matt Michael, to Matthew, with lots of E's and W's there, to Graham Saunders, to D Soul 1990, to Podfan 89, Digital Watt, Our Kez, Craig 4W, Salome Maloney, Vulgar Fancies, Daisy LJIB, Steph R20, MJ Walters, Sled 567 from the United States, Pieman 1969, Saint Gothboy, Dirty Pole, and Tartan Jeff. There you go, some great names there. But thank you so much to all of those people that have left me a review. So, this week we're going to be talking about Black Christmas and Alice Sweet Alice, arguably two of the most underrated early slasher movies that introduced a lot of the tropes that Halloween did, but before Halloween. Later on, I'm also going to have a little chat with Mary Wild. She is a researcher at the British Film Institute, and she lends a kind of Freudian psycho-analytic approach to movies. So she's got loads of really interesting things to say, particularly about the horror genre. So I will be chatting to her a little bit later. But first of all, let's get into the reviews and let me introduce my co-host. Now, this person was the Radio 1 film critic for 5 years. She's also the presenter of the hugely successful Radio 4 podcast, Seriously. She was the voice of the BAFTA Guru podcast. She's been a regular guest on Film 2017 on BBC One. This year she was nominated and specially commended for Podcaster and Blogger of the Year, and she also happens to be my girlfriend. I'm very excited to introduce Rhianna Dhillon. Hello.
Hi. What a lovely intro.
Well,
Thank you.
I know. Oh, and also, crucially, you're the co-presenter of Back Row podcast
Yeah,
with
your
me.
other podcast. Yeah. Just that small little thing that I do. Yeah. Hello.
Hi. Thanks for joining me for this.
Thanks for having me. I think I'd been really upset if you'd basically gone around all the other film critics that you possibly know, and also some that you don't know, and had them on your podcast and not asked me. So it's very, tactically, this is a good move, Mike.
I think so. I think I had to do it, really, didn't I? And I wanted to as well. But, the main, most fun thing about doing this is that I've got to go to all these different critics' houses and explore and see what all their homes look like. Whereas this time I'm just in my own home.
You're in your flat. Which is also my flat.
Which is fine, because I'm just in my pyjamas relaxing today. So it's been quite nice, actually.
And also what's been funny is that we've watched all these horror films together as well.
Yes.
So the ones that we discussed on this podcast, the ones that you talked about in previous episodes, some of them I've watched with you. Some of them I've like walked in on you watching and then had to leave again. I get quite nervous with horror films.
Yeah, you do. So this was going to be my first question. Obviously, that's kind of what I ask everyone to begin with. What is your relationship like with horror movies? How do you feel about the horror genre?
Well, I have to admit that historically I've always said that horror is my worst genre, and just because I'm so scared, I'm such a wimp. I say that as quite a quite a flippant comment, but actually I have seen quite a lot of horror in my time.
Yeah.
Like obviously at Radio 1 I kind of had to face my fears, and that led to some memorable moments, including I watched the Evil Dead remake. And an older film critic walked in like 10 minutes late. It was pitch black. I was already feeling really quite wound up, and he couldn't see, and he put his hand, he slapped his hand on my head and just made me scream so loudly. So I've had I have quite physical, visceral reactions to horror. But having said that, I have seen some that I do really love and can really admire. I just don't enjoy. I know I've heard so many of your previous guests talk about they love being scared, and I know you enjoy that as well. I don't.
Yeah.
So what I like about horror is sort of like the build up and the acting and how they're shot, and I think there are certain films that I love, but I just will never enjoy being frightened.
But you, because it's interesting, because I've had quite a range of people on this podcast who, people like Kim Newman and Alan Jones who love the genre to death and know everything about it, to people like Ollie Charles, who was with me a couple of weeks ago talking about Psycho, who hadn't seen his first horror movie until he was like 22 and then only got into it in sort of recent years.
Which is amazing, because I don't know how you could have avoided horror until you're 22. Clearly didn't have an older sibling. That's kind of how I probably saw a lot of horrors accidentally, or was made to watch them, talk about them. Yeah. So I found that really interesting. How do you avoid horror?
I know, and it's great because that I think it's good to have all the different perspectives on the spectrum. And so you're coming from somebody who, you can appreciate horror, but you don't necessarily choose to sit down and watch them often, do you?
Yes.
Apart from when I force you to.
Yeah, but having said that, when you do force me to, which is pretty much most weeks actually, I think it's helped me come to terms with my fear of horror, weirdly, and sort of realise that actually it's not quite, some aren't as bad as I think, and I think I build them up in my mind.
Yes.
Having said that, I've not been sleeping very well and having nightmares about home invasions. So I definitely put that down to you researching for this podcast. Yeah, absolutely. It's been a horrible few weeks for me.
Yeah, fair enough.
I'm on edge all the time.
Yeah, in this past week, we've watched Black Christmas and Alice Sweet Alice, and we've also watched Halloween, haven't we, as well? Which is quite an important one to watch in comparison with all these other slashers.
And Peeping Tom we've watched, and Psycho.
Yes, and you were there with me for those two as well. So yeah, and you did watch Bay of Blood with me as well.
I watched Giallo with you.
You've been here
found
for
out
all
what a
of
Giallo
them.
was.
Well, this is great because you're coming to the podcast now as a real expert. This is good. So what about slashers then? So let's talk about slashers before we get into these two movies. Of all of the different subgenres of horror, supernatural and ghosts and vampires and monsters, whatever. I mean, what are your thoughts on the slasher?
I've always found slashers to be quite fun, really. I think of slasher and I think Scream, which I know is quite late on, really, considering in the genre. But that was probably my first experience of it. And
mine too, yeah.
Yeah, and just kind of understanding that these are teenagers. Well, that's what I enjoy about it, is kind of teenagers talking teenage shit a lot of the time, and that kind of high school. So it's very much on the cusp of being like a high school comedy, and then it has like these real moments of terror. Yes,
you're right about the teen thing. I think Michael Blythe said a couple of weeks ago when he sort of introduced the slasher that, they are it's no coincidence, but that Scream and I Know What We Did Last Summer were written by the guy who wrote Dawson's Creek, and they are a stone's throw away from watching things like Clueless and Cruel Intentions.
Which is why it's sort of quite a nice ease into that genre.
Yeah.
Ease into horror. If you watch, and the same with things like, I know it's not a slasher, but like Final Destination as well. It's still that group of young people. I remember watching Final Destination alone at home once, and that people always talk about hiding behind their sofas and all that kind of thing, and they did that when they were kids. But that, I remember really having to, I kind of sat on the very top back of my sofa, pressed up against the wall, like as far away as I could get from the TV, while my back was still covered, because I was genuinely, it was, I still got a weird sort of adrenaline rush out of it. I didn't turn it off. So maybe I don't hate horror as much as I think I do.
You don't. You love it, really. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned teen movies there in relation to slashers, because I think that's going to be a big topic of what we're going to talk about this week. Up until this point, Giallo, Peeping Tom, Psycho, these are movies that had certain slasher tropes, but one huge one I think that was missing was teenagers. This is the first week so far we're talking about movies that are around adolescence in some way, or about growing up. Both of them in some sort of way.
Yeah, kind of, they sort of bookend your teenage life, don't they?
Absolutely, yeah. You've got one that is about this girl who, she's having her first period, and she's very much at that age where she's on the cusp of growing up. And then, you've got university students that are kind of suddenly dealing with adult realities and problems. And then that's it feels like, for like the rest of time, horror movies are about teenagers, from this point onwards. Why do you think that, like, teenage years and adolescence are so horrific?
Well, so going back to the comedy idea, teenage comedies, like if you think about American high school comedies, or actually anything to do with American high school, there is always a horror element in that anyway, because there are always bullies and stress and those hormones, and it's always always feels like quite a horrific experience. And also, I think there is this general dislike of teenagers. I think teenagers just have a really bad reputation. People are always blaming things on the youth or young people. So in a sense, out of all the generations, they're the most disposable. They're very self-absorbed. They're selfish. And so I think this is just how they're represented. This isn't how I think actual teenagers are.
No.
And so I think filmmakers can kind of get away with an awful lot more when it's teenagers. It is like, I think that's what you say, it's like this strange in-between time, isn't it? When they're not children, it's almost too, it's still too disturbing for audiences to see children be killed, although again, that isn't a film we're talking about tonight. But then maybe killing old people isn't quite as scary, or doesn't pack a punch as much. It's like teenagers is just on the cusp of adulthood and childhood. The ickiness of teenage years, bodily fluids and blood. It's definitely worse for girls, isn't it? Girls, get off way worse than boys in horror movies.
Definitely.
Because the whole obsession with sex and your virginity, and we'll come to that later. But it's true. Teenagers obsess about sex. Teenagers onwards, you obsess about sex. And so they tap into that actually pretty well, although they do make it seem very vapid, and that there isn't much else going on behind. Totally, they have nothing more to talk about other than sex. But I suppose that's not a million miles off what I remember teenagehood being like. Maybe also, it's very accurate. And also, it is that associating with sex with fear, like sex is an exciting thing, but also a terrifying thing when you're like 15, 16, whatever age. Because it's like, it's the unknown. You get barraged at school and from your parents and whoever else with all the dangers of sex as well, of what it could lead safe
to.
Sex and
safe sex, pregnancy, STIs, everything. All of the fear that comes with sex is, again, like, it's all linked in horror movies, isn't it? Sex and death are they almost one means the other in horror movies. Although, going back to the girls get it worse, so when you were growing up, as a girl, it was also the pain element, which was a huge thing. It was like, your first time's going to be awful. And it was never ever really kind of, sex can be great. Well, I suppose it was, but only as a sort of mythical thing. It never felt real. And the most realistic part of it was talking about the
how scary the first time was. It was almost like giving birth, the way people used to talk about it, which was ridiculous, and it was so overblown. As a boy, 14, 15, did you have those kind of...
It was much more as a boy you got taught of what the danger could be, of how culpable you could be if you have sex underage, if you have sex with a girl who's been drinking, whatever it might be, and how
interesting.
If this happens, you are a rapist. If this happens, you are a rapist. Yeah, so
like 15 years ago,
and rightly so. But you do get that. You do get that hammered in as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's really good.
Yeah, yeah, it is good. It is good. But again, it just fills you with fear a lot of the time.
It doesn't make you be like, oh, I really want to rush out. Actually, it probably didn't stop you from wanting to rush out and have sex.
Well, I was happy to just stick to porn. But anyway, we're getting more and more personal now. Let's get into the movies then. So we are going to cover two movies tonight. One was released in 1974. The other was 76. But I think we're going to flip them round and talk about the later one first, because just I think in terms of themes and conversations and talking points, there might be easier to talk about the later one first.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
It could bring about interesting discussions. So let's start with our review of Alice, Sweet Alice.
Alice was too old to play with dolls and too young to make love. Brooke Shields, as you've never seen her before. She was too beautiful to play with boys and too young to play with men. So Alice began to play with death.
She's made repeated requests that the kid see a psychiatrist.
She has a knack of making things look like accidents.
It's dead! She tried to kill me!
No more dolls, no more toys. Alice only plays with bodies.
So Alice, Sweet Alice was released in 1976 and it was directed by Alfred Soule. Now this tells the story of a young girl, two sisters actually. So we've got this little girl called Alice, who's played by Paula E. Shepherd, and her sister Karen, who is played by a very young Brooke Shields. And I should probably say actually, before I get any further into this synopsis, I am going to do a big fat spoiler warning. We will be talking about these movies, both this and Black Christmas, in depth, all the way through to the end, including twists and turns. So if you haven't seen these movies, go away and watch them and then come back. It'll be much more interesting for you. So the movie starts with the murder of one of these two sisters, the younger one, Karen, played by Brooke Shields. It's the day of her first Holy Communion, which is, for anyone that doesn't know, this kind of very important sort of rite of passage for Catholics or Christians, where they have the bread and wine for the first time, basically. It's like sort of age 8. So it's very much a childhood thing.
Oh, sorry, because I don't know much about Catholicism. So it's not like, what does it represent? Is it child turning into an adult?
It's not quite, because that's actually young, confirmation, which comes when you're a sort of 11 or 12.
That's confusing.
Yeah, First Holy Communion is more like one of the very first things you do. I mean, apart from your baptism, which you're a baby for, so you're not really, you're not choosing to take part in, it's something your parents make you do. The First Holy Communion, I think, is more supposed to be you as a child are becoming a Catholic now.
Okay, so it's like your choice, your sort of
although let's be honest, all 8-year-old kids get made to do this by their parents. But yes, I think in theory that's what it's supposed to be. Okay. And it's like your introduction to the church properly, where now you're old enough to eat the bread and drink the wine, which is supposed to be the body and blood of Christ and all this kind of stuff.
Was it actually wine?
Yeah, it was. It's red wine. Yeah.
Fun.
I know. Fancy that. Catholic priest giving children wine at 8 years old. Anyway, so it starts with Karen's first Holy Communion, but she is murdered before she gets a chance to go and take part. And she's murdered by what appears to be a little girl wearing a yellow raincoat and a sort of cherub mask. A yellow raincoat that we have seen both her and her sister wear as well before this. This obviously sparks this huge then investigation, that basically everyone at this Holy Communion ceremony finds her body in this sort of coffin box thing with a candle lit in it, so it's sort of covered in smoke. It's all very sort of atmospheric and ritualistic. And then this sparks this big investigation as to who murdered this girl. And actually one of the main suspects is her older sister Alice, who wears the same raincoat and is a little bit odd. Some people think she's got maybe some slight violent tendencies, some aggressive tendencies. She's very angry at the world in general, yeah. The sister, Alice, is on the cusp of becoming a teenager. She is, as opposed to Holy Communion age, she's more confirmation age, I suppose. So you'd say she's on the cusp of becoming a woman. And there's a lot of mentions throughout the movie of, she started getting breasts, or she's had her first period, or this kind of a thing.
Yeah, you say that quite innocently.
Yes.
It's not said quite so innocently in the film, which is really interesting.
No, absolutely. So then as the storyline progresses, it then turns into more of a general kind of slasher serial killer type story, where you've got this killer who wears this yellow raincoat and this mask and killing more and more people. But all these people are people involved in Alice's life in some way: her neighbours, her aunt, her dad, her estranged dad, and so we're trying to sort of figure out who the killer is basically throughout. It's a typical kind of murder mystery. And then at the end, it just turns out to be some crazy old Catholic lady who which
I guessed, by the way.
Yes, which you did. Who is such a devout Catholic that it's essentially like she's punishing Alice, and she's punishing Alice's parents for their kind of non-Catholic values that they had.
So basically Alice's mother was pregnant with Alice before she got married to her husband, who she's now divorced from. So yeah, I mean, lots to talk about there in terms of religion, sexuality. Also, another thing that just struck me, obviously, is that must be one of the earliest examples of this idea of the killer punishing people for not being good Christians, and that's a huge thing that comes in every slasher movie from sort of Halloween onwards, is the virgin, the pure survives, the promiscuous dies, and this is completely overtly that. So we both watched this for the first time for this podcast, didn't we? I'd never seen this before either. Before we get into it deep, what were your initial thoughts? Well, first of all, because in these sorts of films there is always like this slight weird relationship with the church, and so as a viewer, but also watching it now, there was like quite a deep-seated mistrust in the priest from the off, and I was like, who is this guy? He's very creepy, he's very touchy-feely with the girls, very over-friendly with the mother, and as a priest he shouldn't really be that friendly with the mother or the children. But actually that might have just been my sort of 21st century brain kicking in, because he was like the one sort of actual quite pure guy the whole way through. He really was quite a good Catholic priest. So you have all these suspect men in this. You have this neighbour who lives downstairs, who's the landlord, Alfonso, who's this incredibly overweight, obese, mad cat man, which is not as fun as Batman. He's just obsessed. He has all these kittens.
Not as sexy as Catwoman either.
No. Really not. And at first you think he's just a bit, gross. You feel a bit sorry for him, sort of stuck in his room, obviously doesn't want to go out. Alice sort of taunts him, calling him fatso. And then there's a scene where she goes into his room to give him the check from her mother, and he starts to try and molest her in a sort of fit of fury. Like, he hates her but is also sexually attracted to her. And he's got to be 40, 50.
Where are you going? You're not in a rush, are you? I know what you have downstairs.
And it was such a revolting, sort of weird turning point. And there's also a moment where a cop or a psychologist cop person talks about Alice's tits. And, she's supposed to be 12 years old.
She is a weird little girl. Did you notice her tits? When I went to put the tube around her, she looked up at me like she wanted me to feel her up.
And so it had these moments which really shocked me. I wasn't expecting that at all. I thought this was going to be quite a case of, I don't know, good, evil. And then it had all these weird, murky characters just woven in, which never really went anywhere.
No, I don't think... because
it was just comments on her, wasn't it?
It was more a comment on the world in general, isn't it? I think, and the way that men are with women and the way that girls suddenly change, because the character of Karen, who's played by Brooke Shields, is very much supposed to be this pre-pubescent girl, isn't she? And she's a symbol of all that is good and pure. She was born, I'm assuming, of a mother and father who were married, as opposed to Karen.
In wedlock.
Yes, she was the better behaved one, the
she
more
was the
polite
favourite
one.
daughter.
She was the favourite, exactly.
Yeah.
Alice is the one with all the problems, with the attitude.
She's the one with the hormones as well.
Exactly, she's the one with the hormones.
The one who is, 12 going on, 25? Although it's funny, the actress was actually 19.
I know, amazing.
Which actually makes a lot of sense, because she was very good. I thought she was a really good actress. She had a really beautiful speaking voice.
Yes, she did.
As well.
She did. And also it would have been quite a few disturbing scenes that she would have had to have done if she was 12. It would have been a bit much. But actually, it still was disturbing because she did still look young. I mean, maybe she didn't look 12, but I wouldn't have guessed she was as old as 19, actually.
No.
She had a real young face as well,
So I thought, her character was interesting.
Yeah.
They did some, really messed up stuff.
Yeah.
And let's talk about her relationship with her mum, because that was a very complex one.
Yeah,
and
it was.
took the whole film to unpick, really.
But it was nice. It was quite a real mother and daughter relationship where you could tell they both loved each other, but at the same time they just did not understand each other. No. Suddenly there's this barrier, and again it's like she'd become this teenager. Suddenly the mum had no idea anymore, and the movie is shrill. Like the first hour of the film, it feels like all they do is yell at each other.
Yes.
And obviously they've both lost another family member. They've lost the youngest daughter, so they're upset. There's a lot of hysterical crying and shouting and screaming.
Have it your way, Catherine, but the child belongs in school. This is my house. You won't be here forever. I can't wait till you're gone.
I forbid you to talk to your aunt that way.
She makes me so nervous. I do everything wrong when she's around.
But you don't mean what you're saying. Aunt Annie loves you. She only does things for your own good. If you'd listened to her, you wouldn't have dropped the milk.
Why is she always right?
Catherine!
You'd always take her side.
That's enough.
We've read up on some reviews, and this has been written by a lot of critics, but it really reminds me of the Italian giallo movies, way more than American sort of Hollywood slashers or horror movies of that time, of that decade, Like when we talk about Black Christmas, they couldn't be more different, I think, in the way that they look. One is like this kind of gothic candle-lit fireplace, almost like Ghost Story. And this one is so brightly lit. Everything looks whitewashed, like it's overexposed. And everything is, almost every scene, even all the murder scenes are set in the daylight, in sort of harsh daylight.
Yeah, every murder takes place in daytime.
Yeah.
Every single one.
Yeah.
You don't see night in this at all.
And the music is quite extreme. It's not necessarily horror music either. It's just but it's dramatic. It's melodramatic music. And again, all this reminded me a lot of the Italian giallo, and it had more of a cop kind of procedural mystery thing than it did trying to scare you, I think. I didn't find it at all scary.
The scariest bits were kind of right at the beginning, where the sister scares her.
Yes.
Alice scares Karen.
Yeah.
She's wearing a mask and then she takes it off and there's another mask underneath. And that's a real kind of what moment.
And the mask itself, the look of the killer is creepy.
Yeah, so it's like I think it was like an old Halloween mask they used to sell in the 50s. And like a corner shop one. So I think it would have been quite common, weirdly, at that time.
Yeah, interesting. Because I thought it felt really deliberate, because it was like this kind of baby-like cherub face that you'd imagine would be very pure, but it's covered in makeup. It's got this kind of dark eyeshadow and this really red lipstick painted on this cherub mask.
What was horrible was you see the death of Karen on screen.
Yeah.
You see her die, and I wasn't expecting that. Seeing a child die on screen is something that Black Christmas shied away from.
Yes.
And I think quite a lot of films, that takes quite a lot to show that.
Yes.
And then not only do you see her die, you then, like you said, because a candle is put in this box with her body, you then see a picture of what her body looked like afterwards, and it's horrific.
Yes.
And it's such a nasty, unnecessary moment.
Yes.
But it needed it, because otherwise it would have been just almost like a sort of cop, like you say.
Procedural. But yeah, definitely the opening scene is the one that really packs a punch. Starting your film with a little girl being brutally murdered on screen is really like that
little Catholic girl in church about to sort of, she's got rid of her sins. And,
yes, exactly. Go through her next rite of passage or whatever. It was quite a powerful thing. But yeah, from that moment onwards, I'm intrigued to know if the director Alfred Soll actually was trying to scare us, because it doesn't feel like it.
No.
Kim Newman told me, in episode 1 of this podcast, he talks about what is horror, and he says, in his opinion, horror is more a style than it is a story or whatever. That it's all about how something looks, how it's shot, how it's scored, how it's lit, and this is like, on paper, it's definitely a horror film. It's got somebody in a mask stabbing people to death, but actually in execution, it doesn't feel.
It's more
so
a thrill.
much.
It's more a whodunit.
Yeah.
And what's funny about that is it is a whodunit because we're allowed to see who this killer is, what they look like in terms of the mask, the coat, which is supposed to be very creepy, and it is actually, because it's the idea that it might be a child doing this. And so if you think about other films like Halloween or Black Christmas, where the killer is sometimes it's the killer's point of view. The viewer is the killer, and you also don't really see the face. You might see glimpses of it, even in Halloween with the mask.
It's always in the shadows.
It's in the shadows. It's from afar. You kind of see a very brief split second here and there, and so of course, and it's the same with any horror. As soon as you see what the real fear is, whether it's supernatural or it's always terrifying until you see the monster. And then it loses a bit of an edge. And so from this, it was like immediately we saw what it was doing it. And yes, it was creepy, but you weren't like hiding behind your sofa.
No.
And actually then they tell us, maybe 2/3 of the way through who the killer is.
It does a very Hitchcocky thing there then, doesn't it? At that point? Yeah.
It tells us that the bomb is there. And
totally. It does a Norman Bates almost. It does it, like you say, 2/3 of the way through, we know who the killer is and no one else does. I don't know whether they did that a little too early.
I think they did it too soon.
Yeah.
That was a bit frustrating, because although I had guessed that it might be that woman, I didn't know for sure. And I don't know, they could have kept that going.
I think the problem was maybe that the reveal isn't that exciting, that it wasn't.
Yes, because we're never aligned with that old lady.
It was just some random woman who we've seen in about 2 scenes who just decides she wants to kill all these people because they're badly behaved. Yeah. It wasn't really anything to do with the daughter, to be honest, or the daughter's relationship with the sister, or what we were led to believe it might be. And so, from in that last third onwards, it's kind of a little bit interesting because we're following her and we know it's her and other people don't. But at the same time, it ran out. It lost
momentum.
It did lose momentum. Yeah, I think it did.
It did.
But actually, the kill scenes, because of what we said about how it's all everything's quite matter of fact and everything is quite in your face and brightly lit. The kill scenes are really like like with the child murder at the beginning, they don't hold back. They show you everything. And again, this is quite a giallo thing where you see that knife go into people and you see the blood spurt, and all these other. There's a moment when not only a child, it does the two things that most horror movies never deem to do, which is harm a child and harm an animal on screen. And they do both in this as well. You see that quite disturbing moment when the little girl grabs the cat and sort of harms it in order to...
she kind of grabs this poor little kitten by its neck and then throws it on the floor. And it's kind of that, and you're supposed to be thinking, oh, is she the killer at that point?
She's kind of showing tendencies of, she's harming animals.
Exactly.
But everything is kind of laid out for you in front of you. It's like nothing is very subtle. And every kind of shot, I think that it's actually shot really well. And every composition of every shot, it feels like, has some kind of statue of Jesus in it, or a crucifix.
There is lots of iconography going on.
Yeah, it's like constantly like God is looming over and judging these characters in every single shot. You're reminded of Jesus with his crown of thorns and all these different things and all these different symbols. So it's full of all that kind of thing. And like you said, I think when you talked about the synopsis, like it pretty much just mainly, it feels like it's showing the hypocrisy of Catholicism, I think, through and through, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
What it feels
from
like.
Beginning to end.
I never knew you had a little girl. God took her from me the day of her first communion. Don't you see? He waited until then to teach me that children pay for the sins of their parents.
So overall, I would give this a thumbs up. I think it's flawed, but it's really well crafted, and I really enjoyed it. What about you? Would you recommend this to people?
Yeah, I think it's fun. It has got a weird, mysterious air about it. And yeah, I kind of did love that Italian influence, whether or not it was the film influence or just the Catholicism.
Yeah.
It was all very heavy-handed.
Yes.
But I don't mind that. I think in horror, that's okay.
Yes.
In the horror genre, that it pays to be overt with your iconography.
As subtle as a ton of bricks, basically, which a lot of horror is.
Exactly. You're not looking for subtlety. And I think it was quite brave in a lot of places, and I think it went in directions that I didn't expect it to. Wasn't necessarily hoping that it would, and it sort of subverted and challenged what I thought a horror was.
Yes. Lovely. So in a minute we're gonna move on to Black Christmas, but before we do, I'm gonna play you my chat with Mary Wild. So as I say, she is a Freudian cinephile who can probably talk a lot better than we can about some of these issues that we have discussed even with this film and that we're going to discuss with Black Christmas, and a little bit why sexuality is so woven into horror movies, and particularly slashers, and particularly movies that focus on adolescence. So here is my chat with Mary Wild. Mary, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you so much for being here. So first of all, just for people that don't know, tell us a little bit about what you are and what you do. Now, you're like, what do you think? How would you describe yourself? I saw you described on one website as a Freudian cinephile. That is an excellent term. I mean, is that how you describe yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I want that on my tombstone.
It's really cool. It's very cool.
Yeah, I'm a psychoanalytic scholar, and I'm very interested in cinema. Psychoanalysis was my gateway to cinephilia, because I began to see the theories I was reading about Freud's entire body of work really represented in film. And I was also interested in topics like dystopian films, surrealism, cinematic dream sequences, and I love the horror genre. So basically I teach a series called Projections at the Freud Museum. It's been running now for 5 years.
Yeah.
And so I basically do not only themes like the unconscious in cinema, love in cinema, but also auteur studies, so focusing on David Lynch, Stanley Kubrick, Lars von Trier, Polanski.
Amazing. What I mean, obviously, one of the big reasons we're here today is that you've also got a projections course coming up. It's 6 weeks, is it? Is that right? On women in horror movies.
Yes. Basically, it's focusing on the portrayal or representation of women in horror films, and really kind of examining that, approaching that from a Freudian perspective. Freud was notoriously sort of mystified by his female patients, and he didn't mind admitting to it. He was a neurologist. He became interested in the inner life of his patients after he read about hypnosis, and he studied it further and further, and he decided to abandon his traditional medical life to pursue an area that was completely uncharted, the scientific study of the unconscious. And he would say that the fantasy life of women really intrigued him and mystified him. He didn't quite understand female desire. Yeah. And I guess in Victorian times, in the times that he was working in, there were very different times to the modern times that we live in now. And I think that he wasn't afraid to admit that female sexuality was something that he couldn't quite understand. He couldn't get quite come to terms with as a medical professional. But the theories that he came up with were so dynamic and so interesting, and I guess amenable to an application to the arts. A lot of surrealists adore Freud. Right from the beginning, they were obsessed with him, and his ideas are often represented in those early surrealist content like Dali and Magritte. And, you know? So, and for me, there's such a natural kind of harmony between psychoanalysis and cinema.
Yeah.
And because I love horror films and I'm very interested in the universal feeling of fear, it's such a powerful emotion, and it's something that is felt across cultures and time. I guess I'm very interested in the underpinning kind of psychological mechanism of fear and what's really happening for a cinephile or film audience member when they engage with a horror film.
Yeah.
There's that kind of like entwined dual system of terror of seeing something, but also kind of fascination.
Yes. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And they want to kind of know more about it, but in a very reluctant, ambivalent way.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting to explore. So, and I wanted to focus it on women because I remember telling someone recently, it was a male friend of mine, that I was going to be planning a course on women in horror films. And he said, well, what's there to talk about? There's only one aspect, and that's women are victims. Usually women are victims. And I couldn't disagree more. It's so varied. Of course, that is an element of it.
Yes.
But, often the drama of a horror film is that the woman is a perpetrator, or she is a representation of dread.
Absolutely.
Or mystery. And so there's a lot there to unpack.
And I wanted to ask you as well. I read a little bit about how, you're going to be exploring now I'm going to get this pronunciation wrong. It's Julia Kristeva. Is that right? Julia Kristeva's theory of abjection.
Yes.
What sort of roughly is that theory?
Basically, for Julia Kristeva, the abject or abjection is a kind of state that's between, sort of located infuriatingly between being a subject and the object of representation. So there's some element of an experience, like an experiential, phenomenological experience that where the individual feels they're cast out. They're no longer a subject.
Right.
They're kind of on the fringes. It's something that is akin to like something that's taboo or in some ways problematic, or there's something attached to it that is I guess a kind of purveyor of uncertainty or terror or shame or a lot of negative connotations. So for example, she gave the state of abjection, and she attributed that to things like corpses.
Right,
because a corpse is like for her, that's the kind of paragon of abjection, because it's no longer an individual human subject with, it's no longer like a living autonomous being, but it's also no longer, it still possesses some qualities, some familiar, uncanny qualities of the person who's deceased.
Yes.
So it's now in a state of abjection and a kind of cast off space, which is very problematic to confront, because it reminds the individual who's gazing upon the abject of things like mortality,
right,
or something that is kind of like no longer able to be integrated into society. It's sort of like cast off.
Okay.
Yeah. So she also gave examples of abjection connected to, for example, a lot of properties connected to women, she herself speaking as a woman, things like menstrual blood.
Yeah.
Actually, she gave a lot of examples of bodily fluids.
I was going to say, it's basically all the stuff that we were sort of quote unquote grossed out by.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
Movies,
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, horror is filled with that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
And it is strange, isn't it? Why is it that we go and pay our money to go and watch movies where we do experience fear and disgust or abject or whatever, why do you think that is?
Unconsciously, like unknown to our conscious personality, our conscious mind, beneath the threshold of our awareness, there's all kinds of things happening that actually affect our behavior, affect our decision making, our personality, but there are things that we're either just kind of oblivious to or too frightened to confront. It's all happening below the unconscious. And I think that the unconscious is filled with, impulses that we might not want to act out in society because we'll get judged, or things we're fascinated by that, might not be socially acceptable, things that frighten us. And I think that in a way, horror films are kind of like a safe space, to coin a term.
Yeah.
A kind of sublimated, acceptable space in which we can kind of safely expose ourselves to a source of fear and kind of act out the process of being afraid, and kind of in a way connecting to what's been repressed in our unconscious.
Yes.
And in a way, kind of, it's like a safe functional, healthy way of connecting to something that is no longer a part of our consciousness. It's just for the duration of the 2 hours of the film or whatever time, and we have suspension of disbelief. We enter this universe of the film. We act out those unconscious fears through the narrative of the film. And then it's like over, and hopefully we don't go out and like do something more destructive. I think I think I'd explain it that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like a kind of outlet, I suppose.
Yeah,
for us,
like a channel.
It's a cathartic sort of thing.
Totally.
Yeah. So you touched on Freud briefly already, but I just want to ask you a little bit more about him. I mean, when you say Freudian cinema, what exactly does that mean then? How does what Freud studied and discovered actually then link to filmmakers and cinema, and particularly horror cinema?
So Freud, like I said, he traditionally came from a very scientific background. He was actually on the verge of making some, very, very important neurological discoveries in his career. But he became very fascinated and intrigued by the inner life of his patients. And he would listen to them speak about their life. They would complain about psychosomatic symptoms, often things like losing their voice at certain times, pains in their arms, temporary blindness, all kinds of like physiological complaints. And over time, as they would kind of speak about their life and the dramas occurring in their life, patterns of behavior, over time, he discovered that through the process of speaking to them, their physical symptoms would become alleviated. So he discovered that really they were just psychosomatic. It was just stress that was locked into the body, and through the process of talking, they were relieved of that. And one of his patients, who went by the alias of Anna O, her real name was Bertha Pappenheim, she coined the term talking cure. So that goes for psychotherapy. And she said, Dr. Freud, every time I talk to you, it's like the talking cure. You relieve me of my physical pain. And so he became very convinced that the unconscious, things that they were not aware of, had a huge impact on their life. And so he began to study things like hypnosis. He experimented with dream analysis. He would have them really connect to engage with their dreams and give them exercises to kind of try and interpret their dreams. He would give them like projective tests, give them benign objects that they would then kind of attribute their own meaning to, which I believe in a way film is a kind of projective test. So he had all kinds of different techniques, such as even analysis of parapraxis, which is like slips of the tongue, or the Freudian slip, where you say something by accident, in brackets accident, but actually it's something that your unconscious really wanted to express. And so he had all kinds of techniques to try and approach and examine their unconscious. And really I think the gist of Freud is that he was someone who always, he never claimed to have invented the unconscious, not at all. He famously said, everywhere I go, I find that a poet has been there before me. So he acknowledged that poets, philosophers, artists before his time for millennia had been engaging with unconscious material and trying to kind of come to grasps with that universe of our inner life, but that he was actually the first one who would systematically create a kind of scientific mode of study to try and understand our inner life. He jokingly referred to himself as the conquistador of the psyche.
That's great. Yeah.
Chart new territory.
And I suppose now, like you say, poets did it, or whoever, artists for millennia, and now filmmakers are doing it, I suppose. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And how much of it comes down to sex? I mean, it feels like a lot of these movies that you're touching upon in your course, and a lot of movies that deal with female psychology, especially kind of female psychology, has a lot to do with female sexuality, doesn't it? Is it just some subject that just inherently baffles all male directors? Because it feels like that is like one of the big subjects, isn't it?
I think so. And I think there is a psychoanalytic explanation for that, in the sense that, especially when even when we look at David Lynch, for example, something like Blue Velvet, a lot of the elements of Blue Velvet really grow out of a kind of wider mystery that is originating in a much more kind of, in a sense, almost simplistic mystery at first. The mystery of, whose
is the ear?
Exactly. but also the mystery of like Laura Dern's character, you know, she's this kind of object of desire, and she sort of presents this very kind of wholesome facade.
Yes.
And there's this idea that Lynch later talked about, and he said, you know, really the whole mystery of Blue Velvet for him was how to get to know a girl like that. And then suddenly, if you let your mind free associate and kind of like run wild, it starts to grow out and into these kind of branch out into other things that really originate from this initial mystery, this kind of origin mystery. You know, and Freud talked about that as well. He said, even on his deathbed, he was still asking, what do women want?
Yeah.
And I think that in a sense, I think female sexuality plays into it. And a colleague, a later colleague of Freud's, Jacques Lacan, who was a French philosopher, psychoanalyst, post-structuralist, he actually went as far as to say that even physiologically, you know, if we look at anatomically how men and women are different, the male anatomy, he said, is very straightforward. The phallus, he said, must rise and fall. But in terms of female sexuality, it's a lot more kind of mystifying, at least from his perspective. And he talked about it being kind of in a state of almost akin to something mystical, because it's kind of like a riddle, and it's you know, it's in a way infinite, and it's the source of life. So it kind of has cosmic things attached to it, signifiers attached to it. My take is more psychoanalytic, and I'm interested in the kind of unconscious motivations, as you say, a lot of male directors. You know, and the way that you know, for instance, how I've structured my course, I'm interested in representations of women in horror films through different stages of life. Adolescence, you know, into even mental illness or problems with identity, the woman within a certain economic model. You know, these kinds of things. And I guess for me, psychoanalysis is a very useful framework to try and kind of contextualize things that we see appear on the screen, and maybe there's an underlying narrative at work.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's touch upon a little bit just the adolescence side of it as well, because I think that does connect to sort of what we've been talking about on the podcast, which is these kind of very teen-centric slasher movies, often to do with very teen-orientated problems. What's your kind of thoughts on adolescence and the way that's portrayed in the horror genre then?
Well, I think that myself being a woman, reflecting back on my time as an adolescent, that time is very kind of challenging. There's a lot of transformations.
There's a lot of horror.
There's a lot of horror. That's true for boys and girls in different ways. The female representation of it is... well, for instance, the films that I chose to focus on in the first session of my course, the adolescence sort of segment of the course, are Carrie, of course.
Of course.
Do you know the film about vagina dentata, Teeth?
Teeth, yes. Yeah.
And in both of those instances, you know, it's really... The element of horror is kind of gravitating around the transformation of the female body during adolescence, this kind of new awareness of the subject with the kind of evolving elements of her body, changing elements, but also her role as a developing woman in society, and messages that are kind of circulating about her, kind of taboo, abject messages that are not... You know, they don't feel at ease kind of maturely bringing those up in a normal conversation. It's sort of things that are whispered and rumored about. The other one I'm obviously including in that segment is The Exorcist. That's another obvious one. Also to do with, you know, the character in The Exorcist, she's a lot younger. She's like a kind of preteen. But the horror around The Exorcist really starts to kick in the moment that the Reagan character, the young girl, becomes aware of her mother's sexuality. You see her in the bed, you know, when she's still normal, not possessed, asking her mom about her male friend, and, you know, are you in love with him? Are you going to marry him? That kind of thing. And then there's a kind of drama with her father. Her mother is divorcing her father, etc. And it's right around that time where we see the kind of narrative moving in the direction of her awareness of romantic dynamics, her own place.
Yeah.
You know, within that kind of context, that suddenly something invades her body. And I like these metaphors of, you know, I feel like the horror genre.
It's great for that kind of metaphor.
Yeah, it provides so many really useful devices to communicate what can be actually experientially very terrifying.
Yes, fantastic. And what's your opinion? I mean, look, we've been talking about the idea of women and how they're portrayed in slashers, and obviously there's quite a kind of weirdly kind of conservative message, really, in that a lot of these movies are, if these girls have sex or misbehave, then they die, you know, and often the quote unquote final girl is the virgin or is, you know, whatever. I mean, what's your sort of take on all of that and the way girls are portrayed in these types of slasher movies?
I think that if Freud were alive today and he saw what the development of the horror genre, he would feel very satisfied that his theories, you know, are so kind of in a way being confirmed. And I say that, you know, kind of acknowledging that I don't believe directors are necessarily kind of creating films formulaically or trying deliberately to prove or disprove Freud. But I believe that Freud's ideas were robust enough that they naturally become kind of apparent in the unconscious of filmmakers. For instance, kind of going back to your question, just in terms of slashers, when we think of slashers, it's kind of like a chaotic universe of, you know, at first we do see some kind of, I guess, some normality, some order, some structure. And then that is slowly sort of starts to unravel. And then there's like an introduction of the horror element, usually a serial killer or some chaotic agent there that kills kind of gratuitously. There's a lot of
penetration.
A lot of penetration. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I would say that the slasher is a really convenient kind of representation of something connected with sex, which kind of it sort of gives an abrupt money shot of something that's usually covered. So for me, I've often thought that a slasher film, all the gore and all the kind of predominance of a representation of blood going everywhere, I can't help but think that it's almost like, in a way, functioning in a similar way to the money shot of ejaculation in porn.
Totally. And we've mentioned that already.
Really?
It is so true though, isn't it? You know, you are watching these movies for that money shot, for that ejaculatory blood spurt or whatever it might be. Yeah.
And I think the reason why it has to kind of, emerge in that way, and the reason why people connect to it in a very visceral level, not even cerebral. It's very kind of, a gut reaction.
Yeah, totally.
I think the reason is because in normal society, in normal civilization, where people have to be polite and there has to be like a kind of acceptable, unspoken code of conduct where, you can't just, say whatever you want, whenever you want, or do things that, without consent, that kind of thing. To have a kind of the context of, in a context like horror films, particularly slasher, when something can occur so dramatically, so forcefully, so, as you say, penetratively, and chaotically, it's kind of, in a sense, I believe, maybe connecting on an unconscious level to a rejection of order and civilization, and a kind of fascination and intrigue with some spontaneity, and also violence. Freud talked a lot about the interconnectedness between what he called eros, so libidinal drive, sexual pleasure, but also the life force and doing things productively to kind of nurture yourself, improve yourself. Eros very much standing in opposition to the death drive.
Right.
He has this entire theory, which his later kind of contemporary colleagues referred to as thanatos, the Greek word for death.
Yes, yeah.
And he said that love and death, eros and thanatos, are very closely linked. They're kind of doing a kind of eternal dance where we simultaneously, we always exist in this ambivalent psychological position of simultaneously being compelled to do positive things for ourselves, pursue pleasure, you know, sexual relations, marriage, family, things like that, contribution to society, but also self-sabotage, destroy ourselves. We have this unconscious desire to, what he said, return to an inorganic state, kind of like destroy opportunities for ourselves, or, you know, get wrapped up in things like addiction or self-destructive patterns of behavior. And in a way, the slasher is like the perfect visual metaphor for what this kind of dual system that Freud referred to, which is the interconnectedness between sexual drives, eros, and destructive death drives,
sort of
thanatos.
Murderous drive or whatever. That's amazing. And I mean, what do you think, sort of briefly, do you think that the portrayal, when you look at these films that you're talking about in your course and everything else, do you think that the portrayal of women and of this kind of side has changed over the years? I mean, like, is there a difference between these movies, horror movies about women from the 60s, for example, like Repulsion, and what we're getting now, like, I don't know, Black Swan or whatever? Or are we basically dealing with the same kind of themes?
Fundamentally, nothing has really changed in the sense that, you know, only in the sense, and I don't mean that in a kind of critical way. I mean that the underlying fascination of how the female appears in a film, fundamentally, that hasn't radically changed in the sense that I think that women can be in equal measure represented as victim, as kind of passive, or someone to feel sorry for, or, you know, very much the opposite, the perpetrator of dread, the perpetrator of violence, the femme fatale.
Yes.
Let's not forget. I mean, that's, you know, something that is a very sophisticated cinematic trope. But I think that it does contain horror elements, more existential horror and existential dread, because often the femme fatale is that embodiment of being simultaneously desirable, attractive, seductive, but also a harbinger of trouble. She represents basically a castration, you know. In psychoanalysis, we refer to castration not just as physical castration, but also the state of losing something that you're attached to. It can be status, money, you know, your heart, whatever it is. She symbolizes, she's kind of like a castrator. So in that sense, I think that there are certain universal themes attached to women in film, which have just endured since the beginning of cinema. But I think it is exciting because I think there is such a, this is a kind of golden age for horror film, I believe.
It feels like that.
It does. It's exciting. And I think people like Polanski, who then in turn inspire people like Aronofsky.
Of course.
You know?
And what's your, if you had to have a favourite, I mean, of all these movies that you're talking about on your course, for example, these kind of female-centric horror movies, what would be the one for you? What's the best?
My favourite is Black Swan.
Is it?
Yeah,
okay. Oh,
it absolutely is. Closely followed by Rosemary's Baby. Because I just think that with Rosemary's Baby, I love how the state of paranoia is just sustained throughout, even until the final frame. And you're still really unsure. I believe it's ambiguous enough that you can never really know whether there was a plot or whether she was actually paranoiac. And I kind of like that in a sense because it keeps the element of horror alive in your memory of the film. It's like it's kind of this torturous purgatorial state of, you know, where Rosemary lives inside that apartment. And the symbol of the apartment in that trilogy for Polanski, preceded by Repulsion and followed by The Tenant.
Yes, absolutely. Amazing 3 movies, actually. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Mary. And again, just for people that want to find out a little bit more about your upcoming events and courses and that kind of thing, where can they find information on that?
So to register for the course on women in horror films, you can visit the Freud Museum website. It's listed there under events and conferences. It starts on the 23rd of October, Mondays 7 to 9 p.m. for 6 weeks.
Amazing. And again, just for people that might want to find you on social media, Twitter, YouTube, that kind of thing.
Sure, yeah. I'm on Twitter and I only post about events that I run these types of courses. My handle is @PsychStar, that's PSYCSTAR. And I also do have a YouTube channel where I kind of experiment with making music video montages, connecting.
They're really great.
Oh, thank you.
Really great.
Yeah, so just use music and scenes and films, things like that.
Brilliant. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. A huge thank you there to the brilliant Mary Wild. Some really fascinating stuff. And if you are interested in going along to one of her courses or finding out more about her, all of her details will be listed in the show notes for this week's episode. Now, it's time to move on to our next review. So this is Bob Clark's 1974 slasher, Black Christmas.
He's expanded his act. Could that be one person? No, Claire, that's the Mormon Tabernacle Choir doing their annual obscene phone call.
So, Black Christmas, this was made in 1974 and directed by Bob Clark. And this is kind of the first one it feels like I'm about to describe that feels like a quintessential slasher movie. So you've got a bunch of girls who live in a sorority house. And it's, I think, the night before Christmas break, before most of them are going to leave and go home for the holidays. And the movie starts with the point of view of an intruder, a lurker, who's kind of watching them through an outside window. And then he climbs up the wall and into the attic upstairs. And then the girls begin to receive sort of menacing phone calls where he's taunting them over the phone, but using all these really weird voices. It kind of sounds like 3 or 4 different people, and he's talking to himself and he's talking to them, and he's kind of shouting sort of obscene things. And then he murders one of the girls in an upstairs bedroom, and he sort of pops her body on a rocking chair in the attic, and nobody knows that she's up there. And then the rest of the movie plays out over the next sort of 24, 48 hours as the remaining girls who are still left in the house while everyone else has gone home. So there's a group of sort of 3 or 4 of them. There's our main sort of final girl, Jess, and there's Phil, and there's Barb, the alcoholic, played by Margot Kidder. And they're left alone in the house while this killer is still in the attic upstairs. And he carries on both calling them on the phone and taunting them and picking them off one by one, basically. So this is a kind of classic slasher movie setup.
Super
really.
festive.
Super festive.
So festive.
I'm just going to start off by saying this is probably my favourite ever slasher movie.
Really?
I think it is just perfect. I absolutely love it. I love it from beginning to end. A very controversial thing I'm about to say, but I think it is better than Halloween. I think it does most of the things that Halloween does, and I think it does some of them better. And it did it 4 years earlier than Halloween did, and yet somehow Halloween has this reputation as being not only the best, but the first kind of quintessential slasher. And this ticks, I think, most of the boxes
if
that
not
Halloween
all of them.
does.
Yeah.
So I've seen this movie to death hundreds and hundreds of times. But what about you? I mean, you watched it for the first time last Christmas?
I think within the last year. So you made me watch it, and now I've seen it twice in a year. So thanks. Actually, I have to agree with you. I really, really like this.
Yeah.
This slasher, although it does really scare me, and I genuinely couldn't sleep very well after watching it yesterday.
It's genuinely scary.
Yeah, it is. And that whole, because it's 2 in 1 really. You've got the slasher, but you also have the home invasion. And it's not a classic home invasion film because they don't realise that it is until the very end.
No, it's not like The Strangers or The Purge or something like that. Yeah.
But for us, the viewer, we know that there is an invader in their home.
Yes.
So there's quite a crossover, which makes it doubly scary for me. But yeah, you're right. We've got that classic teenage thing. These are all, although we say teenage, and when I think teenager, I think young, sort of 15, 16, actually. These are more like 18, 19, possibly older.
They could be in their final year of college, which means they could be 21, 22, potentially.
We are saying teenage, but they are roughly, they're that age. They're leaving uni. And so we're talking quite different themes from Alice, Sweet Alice.
Yes.
Like we said, this is bookending being a teenager. So actually their obsessions with sex are, although still present, are actually more to do with the outcomes of all the things that our parents warned them about, i.e. pregnancy.
Yes.
And
but do you know what? It's not It's not making an issue. Well, I suppose it is making an issue out of it, but it feels like the girls aren't making an issue out of it. That's what I love so much about this film, is that it's not being an abortion issues movie necessarily. It's more that the men are full of issues than the girls are. You know?
Yeah, but what I was going to say, it still has those Catholic themes, actually. I mean, apart from the fact that it's Christian, you know, it's set at Christmas,
yes,
and all those traditions. But our main character, like you say, our main final girl, Jess, wears a cross, a crucifix. I think a couple of them do, actually.
Yes.
And there is the girl who is the typical virgin.
Yes.
But what's really interesting from the off, I want to say it subverts the idea by killing the virgin first, but actually it can't subvert it if it hasn't happened yet. Yeah. So this is before that whole idea of the virgin being the final girl.
Absolutely, yeah.
So actually, what I really like about this is that it tries to set up a very feminist. I mean, it's the 70s. It sets up this very feminist, strong, you know, this woman is absolutely determined that she's going to have an abortion.
Yeah.
She doesn't love her partner. She wants to break up with him. And she knows exactly what she's going to do.
I'm going to have an abortion.
You can't make a decision like that. You haven't even asked me.
I wasn't even going to tell you.
And when she breaks the news to him, he's furious and devastated. And his reaction is, well, let's get married.
Yeah.
And that kind of made me cringe so much. And it felt so, you know, like the antithesis of, you know, what I believe in. And what was great, it was that it made her cringe as well.
Yes.
Do you remember when we first met? You told me about your wanting to be a concert pianist. How it was your greatest dream. And I told you about some of the things that I wanted to do. I still want to do those things. You can't ask me to drop everything I've been working for and give up all my ambitions because your plans have changed. Be realistic. I can't marry you.
Sure you can. What does it change? We could be married. You could still do anything you wanted to do.
Peter, I don't want to marry you.
You know, she is very much a modern woman.
Yes.
And all of them are, actually. And so, yeah, they have this group of feminist women living together in a house. And they're having all these brilliant conversations and they're sticking together and they're being very pro each other.
Yeah.
And she's like, yeah, I'm going to have an abortion.
Yeah.
So you have to deal with that as a man.
Yeah.
This is my body. And we don't see that really in these sorts of films anymore. We see ridiculous girls. We don't see strong women like her so much.
No, totally. It's you know, the characters are what makes this film so brilliant, and also what makes it scary. You know, Kim Newman argued that the reason Halloween is a perfect slasher film is because you care about Laurie Strode, you care about Jamie Lee Curtis, and that's why it's scary. And that's something that all of the sequels lost and didn't realise that when they made them more about Michael Myers and not about the main girls, and that the characters became less and less like characters and more just archetypes to kill off. The first one had Jamie Lee Curtis, who you cared about, which I agree with, but I don't care about any of her friends.
No.
And again, I'll talk about this in depth with Jacob next week, but I hate the other characters in Halloween, and I just want them all to die. And they're so horrible to Jamie Lee Curtis. Oh, you've scared off another boy.
Yeah.
Oh, just go off. Just go and, you know, lose your virginity. You know, they constantly mock her for being a virgin, for being bookish. All of those kind of tropes. This movie has all of the characters you like and you root for. It feels like all of them. And
even the bitch one, who Barb, who's, like you say, played by Margot Kidder.
Margot Kidder, who went on to play Lois Lane. So she's kind of the most recognisable face in the movie. Yeah,
even her, you can. She's not very nice, really, outwardly, but you can see she's incredibly vulnerable, and she has a good heart.
Yes,
but there's obviously something going on. She's just, again, emotional, hormonal. There is something. She might have. You kind of believe that something might have happened to her.
Yeah,
it's not just a kind of flippant, nasty. Not very well drawn character.
No, totally. Like from the first scene where you get Barb on the phone to her mother and you hear bits of their conversation, and it's basically like her mother is sort of saying, I don't want you home for Christmas. Go and do your own thing. And then she gets off the phone and that's when she starts to drink and get aggressive. But first of all, she says, has anyone else doing anything over the holidays? Do you want to do something with me? And the friends will realise it, and they go, yeah, of course, Bob, we'll come with you skiing or whatever.
Except the virgin girl, who she then starts getting... I keep calling her the virgin girl, that's so horrible. Claire, sorry, she has a name.
Yeah.
Anyone want to go skiing for a few days? Yeah, sure, Bob. My mother's taking a place up at Mount Holly's. Anyone else want to come?
Yeah, sounds like fun.
Great. How about you, Claire?
No thanks, Barb. I've made some other plans.
But, she's the only one that says no.
Yeah.
And doesn't really approve of Barb.
No.
And she's the one that dies first.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And that's the thing. It's like they're kind of there for each other throughout the whole film, all these girls. And even though, some of them are a bit dickish at times, they still stick by each other. And they all kind of don't really care about each other's boyfriends as much as they care about each other, you know, and all that kind of thing is what's really nice. And I mean, I don't know, but I feel like this is also how girls talk to girls and how girls are with girls.
Yeah, and not how films make it out that girls talk to girls or about girls.
Yeah.
Because when you see sororities, like when I was saying about with high schools, when you see sororities, you think of like hazing and super
mean girls type stuff.
Yeah, super drunk and really kind of over the top, overtly sexual to the point of just being a ridiculous cliche.
Yeah.
Whereas these women are sexually active. They do get drunk and they can be bitchy to each other, but in very human, recognisable ways. Not just in ways that we've all seen on American television.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is very clever.
Thing. It's not about them being drunk and sexually active.
No, that's
a
just part
side
of
note.
Their humanity.
It kind of goes as a side note that yes, they will have boyfriends and they will have sex with them, and yes, one of them happens to be getting an abortion, one of them drinks, but also they are helping in their community and they do this and they go and volunteer with the kids and they study and they all have careers that they want and they have goals, and it's just, I mean, that's point number one. We haven't even got to the horror movie stuff yet, but I mean, just all of that kind of thing I just think is amazing, because like you said, it subverts all of these tropes before the tropes even exist. It feels like a movie that would have come after every slasher film we're about to talk about.
Why didn't films then, they copied some bits from Black Christmas, why didn't they kind of keep with that strong sexual women who are independent and they don't have to...
Basically, I think it's John Carpenter to thank. And it's not John Carpenter's fault, because what John Carpenter did was create Halloween, which became the biggest movie of all time.
Yeah.
He took some of these tropes from Black Christmas, and he's admitted that now, that he was a huge fan of Black Christmas. And of course, he's drawn upon that and Psycho. And again, he unwittingly created this thing. I don't think he consciously meant to do it.
No, of course not. But why didn't he draw them better, those other girls?
That's just, the writing didn't happen to be as good.
No, it wasn't.
And it wasn't so much John Carpenter, it was actually Deborah Hill who wrote Halloween and wrote the female characters in Halloween. It was a female that wrote it. But it was all about, with Halloween, strip it down, take out these elements, take out these storylines, take out the meat, make it about the scares, and as bare bones as possible. And John Carpenter's movies are as bare bones as possible, aren't they?
Yeah, it's true.
They're just pure entertainment. And but what happened was then Friday the 13th went, I see what they did there. They punished the bad ones and they applauded the good ones.
Yeah.
And then Friday the 13th is what really started it. It took what John Carpenter made an incidental thing and made it into a solidified trope.
Yeah.
And by that point, everyone had forgotten all about Black Christmas, which hadn't been as commercially successful as Halloween and had kind of disappeared. I do think, and again, I don't want to talk too much about Halloween this week, but I do think Halloween is like masterfully directed. It's just not as well written, but I think the way it's directed, the way that John Carpenter frames every shot and the shadows and Michael Myers and the building of suspense is amazing. And, I do think there's reasons why it is like one of the best and most loved slasher movies that I agree with, but I do think that Black Christmas is just so underlauded that I feel like I want to just go around and champion it to death because I just think it's so good.
You're
and
doing
it's
a
so
good
well
job
written.
so far.
Sorry, I'm going to shut up and let you talk.
No. I meant, you're making me watch it. You're making other people watch it. You're talking about it on your podcast.
Yeah.
So going back to then the horror elements of Black Christmas.
Yeah.
So like you said, it starts from this threatening phone call.
Yes.
Which is it's very clever actually, because especially being a group of women alone in a house, it immediately feels like a sexual threat.
Yes, he starts using words like cunt
and he says,
cock.
yeah, he says cunt, and he says pretty pink cunt.
Yeah.
And he repeats that over and over.
Yeah.
So, which is immediately shocking. I mean, this is within the first, I think 7 minutes.
Yeah.
I wrote down 7 minutes. You hear cunt about 5 times.
Yeah.
And for a 70s film, I don't know, I just thought censors, you wouldn't get that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You'd be hard pushed to get that now, really.
Definitely.
And so immediately you're shocked. You're you're like, okay, actually anything could happen.
Anything could happen, totally.
Now.
Yeah.
And that's what I really loved.
Yeah.
Just from the off. And again, you get the very innocent girl, the one with a crucifix around her neck. She goes up to her room, very quickly dies, suffocates.
And it's a really scary death.
Yes.
And it's a really scary image that we get of her body. But
we don't get the same sort of build up that we often get nowadays when someone dies. It's all over and done with in about 30 seconds from the point where she leaves the rest of them to when she's pushed up, stuffed into the attic. It's probably a minute. So it's like it's not so much about the suspense, it's just the shock.
Yeah, it does have suspense, but I know what you mean. It's not so much then about the.
It's not trying to string you along as the viewer of being like building up your heart rate and kind of...
because there's that moment when she walks into her bedroom and then she hears the cat and she kind of looks into her wardrobe, and there's that... It's fairly long-ish, this kind of build-up as she walks slowly towards the wardrobe and we know he's in there and she doesn't before he pounces.
Yeah.
Who is that? Who is it?
But then at that moment, it cuts so quickly, instantly jump cuts to a bunch of people, gasping downstairs at something different.
And actually, the editing in this is amazing.
Yeah,
it's so quick and it's so clever, and it doesn't allow you to kind of remain on the desk, focus on the bodies or anything. You know, we're just really not given that chance.
Yeah, totally.
It's like it's very quick. We have to move on to the next person.
Yeah,
we have to move on to these other characters.
Yeah,
they're gone.
Yeah.
It's really brutal in the way they do it.
Yeah, 100%. It is. It's brutal. And what the movie, even though it doesn't, like you say, it doesn't drag out those moments very much, but the whole movie is like lined with, I think, suspense, even when not much is happening. And I think that's also partly because of going back to what we said about Alice, Sweet Alice. It's the polar opposite. This whole movie is shot and lit. It reminds me of like an old gothic ghost story, like a Christmas ghost story.
It's quite claustrophobic.
Yeah, you've got the fireplace lit. It's kind of crackling fire, and you've got fairy lights, but it's quite dim lighting. And you've got these long staircases and shadowy corridors. And
it's a place where it should be really safe because it's somewhere that they know and they've lived.
Yeah.
And again, it's that home invasion thing.
Yeah.
Where suddenly the place where you should feel at your most safe, you're actually in the most danger.
Yes, Christmas time, you're amongst your friends, you're in your home. Yeah,
it's a happy time. People are feeling festive, and
absolutely,
it's just and it just emphasizes again how vulnerable they are.
And that's another thing that's just brilliant throughout that whole movie is that you have that kind of, I suppose, slight Hitchcockian thing that we know the whole film that he's in the attic, and they don't, and so they're never. We know they're never safe. So again, there's that underlining tension throughout the whole film of any time anyone's in the house, you think, how long are they safe for? Which is brilliant. And I just love that image as well at the end of the opening scene where you just see her. She's got the bag over her head still. She's been suffocated. Her mouth and eyes are still open. And he's propped her up on a rocking chair. She's in front of the window in the attic, just kind of looking out. And he's kind of singing to her.
Brilliant psycho reference.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, Mrs. Bates. Also,
Miss Havisham.
Again, Miss Havisham. Yeah, kind of gothic literature. Yeah, really reminded me of all that kind of thing. Like pure horror stuff. It's really, really good.
Yeah. And
that's
clever.
All just the opening scene.
It's clever. It's not just trying to be one thing, you know. This is multifaceted. This has got a lot of different genres in it as well.
Absolutely. And I think this partly comes down to my taste, because it's not so much about the gore, the stabby gore of a lot of later slasher movies. It's more chilling than it is gross.
Yeah, although what did you say about Barb's death?
Barb's death, yeah, what? It's the best death scene ever.
Yeah, and it's pretty bloody gory.
Yeah, not compared to every slasher that came after it.
I suppose not. But it is the goriest one in there.
Yeah, but it's also the most beautiful. We'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
But yeah, it like the tagline to this film is if this film doesn't make your skin crawl, then it's on too tight.
Yeah, your skin's on too tight. Yeah,
but that's it. It is a film that chills you and creeps you out and makes your skin crawl more than a film that makes you jump and scream and yelp and be grossed out. Because it's got that amazing creepy opening act, and it carries on being quite creepy. The dead girl's dad turns up, which is quite sad and quite creepy, that he's like, oh, I've come to meet my daughter to take her home for Christmas, she's not turned up, and everyone starts wondering where she is because she's the well-behaved girl and why would she have gone missing. But then we go into this like middle act where actually very little death happens and very little scary stuff happens. It's more, you've got gags about fellatio, and you've got Mrs. Mac walking around the house with the dad covering up lewd
naked
posters.
Photos. Yeah,
and I suppose that's the thing. It does like veer into a kind of teen comedy film at times.
Yes, but also with that added thing of this dead girl's in the attic.
Yeah, you still feel,
which is brilliant.
I still feel it, but I know that there are some criticisms of this movie that, as opposed to Halloween, which is designed to scare you from the first second to the last second, played dead straight, and there is nothing that is from beginning to end suspenseful and scary.
Yeah,
this movie feels like it takes a little break in the middle where it's a little bit more like human drama of let's get to know these girls a bit more. Barb has alcohol problems.
Yeah, we get that empathy side, which is what we've just kind of criticising other horrors for not having.
Exactly.
So I think this absolutely needs that storyline of the dad, who is obviously very uptight. We kind of feel a bit sorry now for this girl that we judged initially for being a bit prudish or whatever, and we realise this is why. And then we see actually maybe she wasn't that prudish after all when she has these naked photos in her room.
And she had the boyfriend.
And it's all these first impressions that are just thrown out the window. But also the sadness, because you know that this dad is not going to have a happy ending.
Yeah, it's really sad.
It is.
It's like and again, you feel the death, and that's not something you get often with horror films.
No,
it's really good. You kind of feel it, and that's what I think. The older I get, I suppose. Maybe it's different when you're sort of a 14, 15-year-old audience where you just want to watch scary bits and gory bits with a slasher, and that's totally valid. That a lot of slasher movies you watch with your friends, and you're much more likely to want to watch something like Friday the 13th, where it's like every 6 or 7 minutes there's another gory, imaginative death.
It's much more isn't like that at all. It?
This is a movie where you really feel something, whether it's getting chills or funny or sadness. But I think that's why for me this movie has more rewatch value, and it's more of a classic in my head. It's more of a better made film. I just want to ask you about all the sort of main cast thing, because we talked about them a lot. So obviously we've got our main girl Jess, who's played by Olivia Hussey. I mean, were you a fan of her performance?
Yeah, I think the first time I watched Black Christmas, I thought she was a little bit stilted, almost not stilted, but maybe she should have been in another film. It was like she was in a different movie.
She's quite a sort of classical actress.
Yes, well, famously she played in Juliet in Romeo and Juliet, and is classically beautiful. I think she's Argentinian, British, really beautiful, and has this long hair. She has a very calm voice. She's not hysterical,
not
actually, and maybe that was why I was like, oh, is she in a different film from everybody else? Because you kind of feel like, where is that hysteria? But actually, this time around, I think it fit much more with the way that she made decisions about how upfront she was with her.
She's quite cold.
Boyfriend. Yeah, she was quite cold, but she was quite cold with her. With the boyfriend, but actually with her female friends, she really cared, and she went out of her way to try and help, try and find them. And so actually, no, I preferred her second time around when I kind of understood her a bit more. And I think she kind of had to keep herself a bit at arm's length from Peter, the artist boyfriend, because she knew how highly strung he was, and we obviously find that out through the film. So I think actually the way she plays it is quite clever, whereas you have the very over emotional Barb, the one who is a woman of extremes. Very entertaining. She'd be the one that you'd want to be with at a party.
Yes. She's kind of the one you remember most in the cast as well, isn't she? Not just because it's Margot Kidder, but that character is great.
Yeah. I think she's probably the most recognisable one in all of us.
Yeah.
Barb, dear, you've had too much to drink. Mr. Harrison...
I don't give a shit about Mr. Harrison. I'm sick and tired of everyone in this house insinuating stuff and not coming out with what they mean.
Barb, why don't you go upstairs and lie down for a while?
Shut up. And you leave me alone. God damn you.
She's flawed and she's guilty of not being very nice sometimes. You see her feeding alcohol to a kid at this charity event, which is hilarious.
Absolutely love that.
She swears in front of them. She swears a lot. She talks about sex. She winds up the police. She's, again, absolutely happy to be upfront and say what she thinks. Without being chastised for it, which is very admirable.
What about the brilliant John Saxon, who plays the Lieutenant Ken Fuller? He's awesome.
I've got a bit of a crush on John Saxon, to be honest. Those eyebrows.
He's so cool. And this isn't the last we'll talk about him. I'll be discussing him with James King in a few weeks' time when we talk about A Nightmare on Elm Street. But John Saxon is awesome. He's so good.
He is. He's very trustworthy.
Yes.
And he often plays those characters, doesn't he? Police characters.
Yes.
And you just feel like he is someone that you want in your corner. He believes them. He's interested. He understands. He does something straight away. As soon as he hears that that's where they're getting threatening phone calls is the same house where this girl's disappeared, he immediately goes round and puts a phone tap on. Like, he's proactive. You really appreciate that in a horror film. You don't get that very often, I don't think.
Yeah, totally. He's brilliant. Yeah, really, really good. And he's he feels like the only true grown-up, really, in a way, doesn't he? Because the other cops are all a bit stupid. You've got Mrs. Mack, who's basically like a student. So he feels like the only kind of safe grown-up
the one
presence.
you want to rely on. You kind of want to just go and hold his hand and like he can tell you everything's going to be okay.
No, it's really cool. So we spend time in the second act with like all of these characters, basically sort of getting to know them all and getting to know this scenario, and then we learn that there's a child that's been murdered and the body gets found in the park and everything, and then tension builds, and then we get this like the night draws in, and this is when all the murders start happening again. You get that Mrs. Mack murder, which is an interesting one,
so
where she hears the cat and then she crawls up to the attic, and then what does he kind of swings a hook at her face, or like, and it kind of draws her up. I do think the actual moment when she dies is a bit silly, where you kind of see her disappear upwards into the attic. But I think everything leading up to that is really well done. It's really scary.
It's terrifying, isn't it? And it makes you even more afraid to go into the loft.
Yes. It really makes my skin crawl when she pops her head up and she sees the dead body in the rocking chair, and you see that panic, and then she hears the breathing right behind her, and she slowly turns around.
It's the breathing. It's just the breathing all the way through, which is so horrible because he sounds like he's really got like a blocked nose, doesn't he? It's very like
proper she calls him at the beginning, doesn't she? The moaner. That's what Jess calls her over the phone. But let's talk about the killer, because again, Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, all these types of killers are usually like silent types that don't talk. They don't really have a personality. They're just these kind of figures, this force of death. This guy, we don't really know anything about him, which is what makes him scary. We don't know why he is the way he is, but he has more of a personality, doesn't he? Or multiple personalities.
Well, yeah, he does have multiple personalities. We think that he killed the child. We don't know because we never see it. But we sort of assume, especially because you realise as the film goes on that there's a threatening phone call after every murder.
Yeah.
And
the phone calls are just brilliant.
And the phone call, obviously the film starts with a phone call. There hasn't been a murder that we know of until we find out that a child's been killed.
Yeah. What I love is that you get bits of his backstory maybe through his like rantings over the phone.
Agnes and Billy. Who are Agnes and Billy?
Yeah. And all of this, what did you do, Agnes? Or what did you do, Billy? Why did you kill the baby? All of this really disturbing stuff of like, don't hurt the baby.
But then we think that might be linked to Jess's
possibly
like abortion, because the boyfriend calls her on the phone and talks about her killing the baby.
Yes.
Meaning having an abortion.
Yes.
And then this murderer starts ranting about killing a baby.
Yes, very possibly.
What do you think?
I think it's actually, I need to double check, but I think he mentions something like that even before all that. And that he goes, filthy Billy, I know what you did, Billy. Like, look what you did to the baby, or something, like as if he has killed a baby when he was young, or he was abused as a child baby. Was Agnes's sister? I don't know. But yeah, like, again, you just don't know.
He was Agnes's sister?
No, maybe Agnes was his sister.
Oh.
You know, who knows? Maybe he killed her as a baby.
It'd be quite interesting to see like a transcript of exactly what he says.
Well, he does. He says stuff like that, like, look what you did to Agnes. And then there's moments when he creeps up to the girls and he goes, Agnes, it's me, Billy, shh, shh, shh. And then he kills them, doesn't he? And stuff. So it's like, you know,
picked up on
in
that.
my head, it's like, was he this little boy who was disturbed, who was abused, who killed his baby sister while she was in a cot, maybe, or something?
God, I love that you've kind of created that whole scene. No, that's great. Like, I just was like, oh, this is really creepy. He's got like 3 different people.
Yeah, and it's
like Psycho. I just like everything. I'm like, it's like Psycho. It's definitely like Psycho.
It could be, but what I love compared to with Psycho is that you don't have a blooming psychoanalyst explain the whole thing in a monologue at the end. I love that you just have no idea who this guy is.
Yeah.
Who are you? For God's sake, what are you doing?
I know what you did, Billy! Filthy Billy! Billy!
He isn't this, like, supernatural force.
No.
He is just this raving madman in the attic. Yeah, he is just, I think everything about that character is creepy. I love the phone calls. Again, this is the first time really they've dabbled with this whole menacing phone call thing that obviously becomes a huge part of movies like Scream. And again, it's this gigantic twist that can only exist now in the 70s, where it takes that long to realise that the call is coming from inside the house. And that's part of why the movie just didn't work for me as a remake. They remade it a few years ago, and it makes no sense to me, because that was the whole mystery of that 1970s thing was, where is the phone call coming from? What phone line is it coming from? And it takes them that long to trace it. And that's all part of the suspense. And then there's that amazing reveal. Yeah, he's inside the house with you.
And that phone ringing, you know, that sort of punctuates every like 10 minutes or something. And, you know, the phone should be like literally a helpline.
Yes.
It should be helping the people within the house, but then it becomes like this sort of tortuous,
again, it gives you chills,
device.
Makes your skin crawl every time it rings,
because we know what that means, and they don't.
And there's this there's lots of amazing shots where you get just the phone, this giant phone in the foreground, and then people walking around in the background or whatever. You know, it's really well done.
Let's talk more about the deaths, because I'm dying for you to talk about Barb's death.
Yeah, so Mrs. Mack dies second, and then I think it's Barb next, isn't it? So Barb's death scene, I think, it kind of feels like the centerpiece of the movie. And every slasher movie has its like big kill in the middle of the movie. Usually, you know, it's usually more elaborate or whatever. And this is that one, definitely. You know, it's just this really well edited, really well shot moment where Barb is asleep upstairs. She's had too much to drink and she's passed out upstairs, basically, hasn't she? And first of all, there's a moment when he creeps into the room and she gasps and she wakes up and she starts having like an asthma attack.
Yeah, this is what I love about it as well. All these false alarms, you know, where you often get false alarms in films, and they're just there to scare you.
Yes.
But actually, this sort of furthers the plot even more. You know, she's asthmatic. She's and again adds to all those vulnerabilities and brings Jess up from downstairs to come and run and see if she's okay. And you expect her to, you know, stumble over the body, and actually she's fine. She's just having an asthma attack, you know, and she
says, "Oh, I had a dream that someone was in my room standing over me," and that's just creepy.
So those misunderstandings that we're used to aren't funny or anything. They're really, really dark and scary.
So then she kind of looks after her, gives her an inhaler and puts her back to sleep. And then suddenly Jess starts hearing carol singers outside. And the whole music is kind of decorated with like Christmas music. It doesn't really have like a horror theme. It doesn't have like a Halloween psycho type thing. It's mainly Christmas music that plays. And, you know, again, that can be creepy.
It's
very
creepy.
Hymns are creepy, carols are creepy, all that kind of thing.
Children singing
choirs
are
creepy. Children singing are very creepy.
Captures that sort of that awkwardness as well when she goes out and sort of just watches them.
There's nothing more awkward than carol singers.
I know.
Just watch them sing as they all look at you and sing at you. It's horrible.
It's awful.
So yeah, she gets these carol singers. She goes and watches them, and then at that moment, obviously she can't hear anything going on upstairs. And meanwhile, the killer is still in her room, creeps up to her bed, and he goes, "Agnes, it's me, Billy." and then basically, then the rest of the scene, it cuts back and forth. It's like a montage, and we see Jess watching the carol singers, all very cherubic, innocent children singing and smiling, intercut with Billy, or whoever the killer is, grabbing this glass unicorn ornament, this spiky ornament, and stabbing her in slow motion to death. And it's kind of lit where we see it kind of obscured through the crystals and through the glass. And you just see sort of one hand, I think, come up, and you see the knife plunge down, and you see blood spurt, but you don't really see it in all its graphic glory. It's more... No. What's the word? It's more like kind of expressionist, kind of the way it's done and the way it's lit.
It is quite a beautiful death.
Yeah, it is beautiful. It's kind of dreamlike and weird because it's got this children singing. And it's kind of slow motion. And
it's interspersed with Jess sort of clapping as well. She starts clapping the carol singers as if she's applauding this grand murder.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is just fantastic.
It's just amazing. And it is, for me, there are a couple of others that come later on down the line in the 80s, but it is, for me, one of the best death scenes in any slasher movie ever. It is like a highlight for me. I just think it's amazing. It's beautiful, and it's creepy, and it's scary, and it's gory, and it's everything all rolled into one. I just think it's like a perfect horror movie, really, from start to finish. It's scary, it's fun, it's well shot, it's well lit, it's well, everything works for me about this movie, personally. But I mean, do you have any negative comments to say about it? I won't be angry.
Well, actually, initially, the whole Billy Agnes sort of mutterings thing, I was a bit like, they just kind of push it onto people being mad, it's always a mad person doing it.
Yeah.
And what's the motivation? They're just mad. but actually, you've explained it, you've come up with a theory. Who knows if it's true, but it's a very convincing one. Yeah. So I feel better about that now.
Yeah.
I mean, it does feel like a very feminist film. The female solidarity just runs through it, and as you know, that is one of my favourite topics.
That's why I wanted to get you on this week as well to talk about these two movies, because they are interesting movies to talk about in that respect. All slashers are a little bit, actually, but these actually are feminist movies.
Yeah, and they're forerunners.
Yes,
which I really appreciate. And again, so it's made me sort of reassess what I thought about slasher movies, what I thought about horrors in general as well. Like I said, where women don't often come off. It's not like they do come off very well in the end, but they come across in I don't know. It's got so much more depth to it, this film, than even the title suggests. Black Christmas is quite a throwaway.
Totally, it sounds like a trashy.
Which when you told me that it was your favourite, and I was like, I bet it's crap.
Yeah, it sounds crap. Yeah,
it sounds crap. It does, and also the Christmas element. It's very clever because it's set over Christmas. It's not really as. I don't know.
It's not really about Christmas in any way.
So there's like a film called Krampus, that horror film that came out, which I actually quite like that as well. Yeah. But that's much more about it being Christmas.
I mean, there's a slasher movie in the 80s, literally, and it's called Silent Night, Deadly Night, and it's literally about a serial killer. Father Christmas is a serial killer, and he creeps in down the chimney and murders people. So and that is a stupid Christmas slasher movie.
I thought it'd be something like that.
Yes.
Whereas this is just it's a very excellent horror movie set at Christmas.
Yeah. I do love the production design. I know I talked briefly about it, about the lighting and the fairy lights. Also, the Christmas tree is scary. They even managed to make the Christmas tree look creepy in this movie. It's
like covered in white. It looks like cobwebs. Yes. It looks like a million spiders.
And again, it's that kind of Miss Havisham-esque, like gothic mansion kind of look to it. Everything looks like it's covered in spiders' webs or whatever. Yeah, really, really cool.
Yeah, and although we stray from the house a couple of times, don't we? It's not all set entirely. But actually, the way the most memorable bits are, which I really love that because it gives it a very sort of cyclical feel. I suppose
it really does, because obviously it starts with us going into the house and it ends with us panning out from the house. Yeah,
and but from the with the killer actually from beginning and end.
Yeah, it's really good. Poor Jess, I know. I mean, I suppose if I had one negative, it might be that there's that kind of middle section lull slightly, that the kind of comedic scenes of them with the kids or them doing the fellatio joke in the police station and stuff. Maybe that could be trimmed a little bit in places, because I just love it whenever they get back into the house and it gets back to that kind of creepy sorority house thing again. But overall, I love it. It's for me, it's the highlights for me of talking about all of these slasher movies is this one.
Agnes, it's me, Billy.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for this. I've loved it.
You're welcome. It wasn't a hardship. I like chatting about horror with you.
It's good. Please tell everyone out there where they can find you on things like social media and podcasts and things like that.
Oh God. So I hate this. I hate selling myself.
I know you do.
So on Twitter, I'm at Rhianna Dhillon. You can find me doing Seriously podcasts for Radio 4, which is a great sort of documentary series. Actually, nothing to do with film, just some really lovely short form docs. You can find Seriously basically wherever you're listening to this podcast. You can also find Seriously.
And you're always popping up on TV and radio and stuff. So
yeah,
just
I'll be on Channel 5 or BBC One or Front
Sky
Row.
Movies.
Yeah. You'll see me about, or just in your local cinemas where I'm normally hanging out.
Lurking.
Yeah. With my little glass unicorn in hand.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's guests, Rhianna Dhillon and Mary Wild. Now, don't forget, if you want to find out more about Mary Wild, you can follow her on Twitter at PsychStar. That's PSYC star. She does have an upcoming series of courses going on in London at the Freud Museum. As she mentioned, it's going to be basically a 6-week evening course on the psycho-analytic investigation of women in horror films. Sounds absolutely awesome to me. That starts on the 23rd of October, so please do go ahead and book yourself into that. I think it could be really, really interesting. You heard a mere snippet there of what Mary has got to offer. Now, don't forget, I would love to hear back from you. What are your thoughts on Black Christmas and Alice Sweet Alice? Where do they rank for you in the great pantheon of slasher movies? Please do send feedback. You can tweet at EvolutionPod or email evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. Now, next week, it feels like we're finally reaching the movie that we've been building up to. This is the movie that most people consider the quintessential slasher, and I think it's a perfect time to review it as we are right now smack bang in the middle of October in the build-up to Halloween. So we are, of course, going to be reviewing John Carpenter's Halloween. There's so much to talk about with this film that we're not going to review it alongside another movie. It is going to be a whole episode purely on Halloween. I'm going to be joined by two incredible people. My co-host is going to be Jacob Stallworthy. He is the culture critic for The Independent, and also Halloween happens to be his favourite horror movie of all time. And I'm also very excited about my other special guest. He is a film critic for the biggest movie magazine in the world, and he also happens to host the biggest movie podcast in the world. I am, of course, talking about Empire Magazine's very own Chris Hewitt. So Chris Hewitt will be joining me. Halloween is one of his favourite movies. John Carpenter is one of his favourite directors, so he's going to talk to me about all things Carpenter and Halloween. Cannot wait for that. So a really, really big, exciting episode for you guys next week. Thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon for the evolution of horror.